Lieutenant Layla adjusted her tactical harness for the 100th time, trying not to look as bored as she felt during what had to be the most dramatic military briefing in the history of overly dramatic military briefings. The hegemony's finest brass stood around a holographic display table like they were planning to storm the gates of hell itself, when really, if the intelligence reports were accurate, they were sending one moderately competent human to peek through some alien windows. "The Umbral Pack," announced Commander Thane, his voice dropping to that special register reserved for discussing particularly nasty space monsters, "represents the single greatest predatory threat in known galactic space." Oh, how wonderfully terrifying. Layla managed not to roll her eyes, but it was a close thing. She'd heard variations of this speech before. Insert alien species name here, add adjectives like vicious and bloodthirsty, sprinkle in some horror stories, and voila, instant justification for whatever questionably legal operation they needed a special forces operative to carry out. The hologram flickered, displaying what looked like a cross between a bear and a wolf. If both animals had decided to hit the gym religiously and develop an attitude problem. Standing roughly 8 feet tall with midnight black fur and glowing amber eyes, the Umbral certainly looked the part of galactic boogeyman. Their claws were the length of combat knives, their fangs could probably punch through starship hull plating, and their shoulders were broad enough to use as landing platforms for small shuttlecraft. "Intelligence suggests they've established a breeding colony on Nexus Prime's third moon," continued the commander. Because of course they had. Why wouldn't the galaxy's apex predators choose the most remote, inhospitable rock they could find to raise their spawn? "We need eyes on the ground, population estimates, defensive capabilities, social structures, the works. And you want me to waltz into a nursery full of baby murder machines because?" Layla asked, raising an eyebrow that had perfected the art of silent insubordination. The commander's jaw tightened. "Because, Lieutenant, you're expendable enough to risk, but competent enough to maybe survive the experience. Besides," he added with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, "humans have a unique advantage in this particular scenario." Ah, here it comes. The part where they explain how being the galactic equivalent of a chihuahua somehow makes her the perfect candidate for infiltrating a den of cosmic apex predators. Layla had heard this song before. Humans were small. Humans were overlooked. Humans were underestimated. The galaxy's newest members, barely a century into their membership in the hegemony, still treated like the awkward kids at the lunch table of interstellar politics. "The Umbral have never encountered human physiology," the commander continued, clearly warming to his theme. "Our scent, our pheromone signatures, our biological markers, we're completely alien to their sensory profile. You'll be invisible to their detection methods." Right. Invisible. Like every other invisible human operative who'd been sent on similar missions and come back with stories about how surprisingly not invisible they'd turned out to be. But Layla had rent to pay and a career to maintain, so she nodded with the appropriate amount of enthusiasm. "The insertion will be via stealth pod during their sleep cycle," added Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, pointing at orbital trajectories that made the whole operation look deceptively simple. "You'll have 36 standard hours to gather intelligence before extraction. Plant the surveillance devices, map their territory, count their numbers, and get out." "What about adult males?" Layla asked, because someone had to ask the practical questions that might keep her from becoming an interstellar chew toy. "Hunting expedition," the commander replied smoothly. "Intelligence indicates the males leave the colony for extended periods, probably pursuing large game on the moon's southern continent. You'll be dealing primarily with females and juveniles." Oh, fantastic! Because everyone knew that mother predators were just adorable pushovers when it came to protecting their young. Layla could already picture the mission reports. Lieutenant died horribly because she encountered a protective mama bear the size of a small starship who took exception to her presence near the nursery. But she'd signed up for this life, and the hegemony wasn't exactly known for accepting thanks, but no thanks, as a viable response to mission assignments. Besides, the hazard pay for this particular adventure would cover her student loans for the next decade, assuming she lived long enough to spend it. The briefing wrapped up with the usual warnings about maintaining communication protocols, and the even more usual reminders about what would happen to her family if she decided to defect to the Umbral Pack. As if that was even a possibility. She'd seen the dietary requirements in their species profile. They consumed roughly 50 pounds of raw meat per day, and their idea of a balanced meal apparently involved things that were still struggling when they started eating them. 6 hours later, Layla found herself strapped into a stealth insertion pod that looked like someone had crossed a coffin with a torpedo and decided to make the result as uncomfortable as possible. The pod's AI had a voice like synthetic honey and the personality of a particularly cheerful funeral director. "Insertion in T-minus 60 seconds, Lieutenant," it chirped, because apparently even military AIs had been programmed by people who thought exclamation points made everything better. Current atmospheric conditions on Nexus Prime 3 are within acceptable parameters for human survival, with only a moderate chance of immediate death upon landing. "How? Moderate?" Layla asked, checking her equipment one final time. Surveillance devices, emergency rations, medical supplies, and enough firepower to theoretically discourage anything short of a small army. In her experience, theoretically was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that assessment. Approximately 15% chance of fatal impact, 12% chance of exposure-related fatality, and 8% chance of immediate consumption by local fauna. The AI responded with the same enthusiasm most people reserved for discussing vacation plans. So, roughly a 65% chance of survival, assuming she didn't run into any of the galactic boogeymen she was being sent to spy on. Those were practically good odds by Special Forces standards. The pod shuddered as it separated from the transport ship, and Layla felt the familiar sensation of controlled falling that accompanied every insertion mission. Through the tiny porthole, Nexus Prime 3 looked like someone had taken a standard moon and decided to paint it in shades of purple and silver. Beautiful, in that probably hiding horrible death way that seemed to characterize most alien worlds. "Landing zone approach in 30 seconds, announced her cheerful death capsule companion. "Remember to bend your knees on impact and try not to die immediately. The hegemony has invested considerable resources in your training." The pod hit with enough force to rattle her teeth and remind her why she'd chosen Special Forces over a nice, safe desk job. The hatch hissed open, revealing an alien landscape that managed to be both eerily beautiful and vaguely menacing. Crystalline formations jutted from the ground like frozen lightning, and the air had that particular quality that suggested it might be trying to kill her in subtle, long-term ways. Layla shouldered her pack and activated her environmental scanner. Atmosphere was breathable, gravity was manageable, and according to her instruments, she was currently alone on a moon that was supposed to be home to the galaxy's most feared predators. She'd been in worse situations, though admittedly she couldn't think of any specific examples at the moment. The mission clock started counting down from 36 hours, and Lieutenant Layla began her trek toward what intelligence optimistically called the primary Umbral settlement. Behind her, the stealth pod's self-destruct mechanism activated, erasing all evidence of her arrival in a brief flash of light that probably wouldn't attract any unwanted attention. Probably. 2 hours into her reconnaissance mission, Layla had to admit that the Umbral Pack had excellent taste in real estate. Their settlement sprawled across a natural bowl in the moon's surface, protected by towering crystal formations that would make attacking from orbit nearly impossible. The structures themselves were a fascinating blend of organic curves and geometric precision, clearly the work of a species that understood both engineering and aesthetics. What the structures were not, however, was particularly well guarded. Layla had been expecting patrol routes, sentry posts, maybe some kind of early warning system. Instead, she found pathways that seemed designed more for convenience than security, and buildings that appeared to prioritize natural lighting over defensive positioning. Either the Umbral were so confident in their reputation that they didn't bother with basic security measures, or the hegemony's intelligence division had gotten something spectacularly wrong. Given her experience with military intelligence, Layla was leaning toward the latter. She crept through what appeared to be the settlement's outer ring, planting surveillance devices with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this dance before. The structures around her hummed with a low, almost musical resonance that seemed to come from the crystal formations themselves. It was actually rather soothing, which struck her as an odd architectural choice for a species supposedly dedicated to ripping throats out. The first sign that something was seriously off came when she rounded a corner and nearly walked face first into what could only be described as the galaxy's most intimidating playground. Structures that looked like they'd been grown rather than built twisted up toward the purple sky, creating a complex network of ramps, platforms, and tunnels that would have made human children weep with envy. The second sign was the sound. If the hegemony's xenobiology reports were accurate, adult Umbral communicated through subsonic growls that could allegedly liquefy human internal organs at close range. What Layla was hearing, however, sounded more like a cross between chirping birds and purring cats, with occasional huffing noises that reminded her of puppies playing tug-of-war. She activated her recording equipment and crept closer to investigate, because apparently her survival instincts had taken the day off. What she found in the central plaza of the playground made her question not just the intelligence reports, but the basic competence of every xenobiologist in the hegemony. 3 young Umbral, cubs, she supposed, though they were each roughly the size of a small pony, were engaged in what appeared to be the galactic equivalent of tag. They bounded between structures with liquid grace, their midnight fur gleaming in the alien sunlight, their terrifying claws leaving barely visible scratches on the crystal surfaces as they scrambled for purchase. The one in the lead, slightly smaller than the others, but moving with obvious confidence, suddenly stopped mid-leap and turned toward Layla's hiding spot. Its amber eyes, which were supposed to be windows into a soul of pure predatory malice, fixed on her position with unmistakable curiosity. For a moment, that stretched like taffy, human and alien regarded each other across the plaza. Layla's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm, while her brain ran through the various ways this encounter might end with her becoming an exotic snack. Then the cub tilted its head to one side, made a sound that could only be described as an inquisitive chirp, and bounded directly toward her. This was it. This was how Lieutenant Layla's career would end. Mauled by something that looked like it should be starring in a nature documentary about adorable baby predators rather than serving as the inspiration for interstellar horror stories. The cub skidded to a stop about 3 feet away, close enough for Layla to see that its vicious fangs were still the small, relatively blunt teeth of a juvenile. Its razor-sharp claws appeared to be designed more for climbing than combat. and its aura of menacing predatory intent was currently expressing itself as excited panting and a tail that wouldn't stop wagging. They stared at each other for another eternal moment. "Well," Layla said aloud, because talking to potentially dangerous alien juveniles seemed like exactly the kind of career decision that had gotten her this far, "you're not quite what I was expecting." The cub's ears perked up, actual, honest-to-goodness perked ears, like a dog hearing the treat bag crinkle. It made another chirping sound, this one with a distinctly questioning inflection. "Oh, fantastic," Layla muttered. "It thinks I'm interesting." The other two cubs had noticed the interaction and were approaching with the cautious excitement of children who'd discovered something new in their backyard. The middle one, slightly larger and more cautious, hung back a few feet. The third, smaller but with an unmistakable air of mischief, circled around to get a better view from a different angle. Layla found herself in the unprecedented situation of being surrounded by juvenile apex predators who seemed more interested in making friends than making her into lunch. Her training had covered a lot of scenarios, but what to do when the galaxy's most feared species displays behavior indistinguishable from curious puppies hadn't made it into the curriculum. "You're Holt, aren't you?" she said to the first cub, deciding that if she was going to die horribly, she might as well try to gather some intelligence first. The name seemed to fit. It had approached with the confident directness of someone used to being the leader. Holt's ears perked even higher, if that was possible. He, and Layla was suddenly certain it was a he, made a series of excited chirping sounds that had an unmistakably affirmative quality. "And you two must be Nix and Blitz," she continued, looking at the cautious middle cub and the mischievous smaller one. The cautious one, Nix, presumably, took a half-step backward, but continued watching with obvious interest. The smaller one, who practically radiated chaotic energy, made a sound that could only be interpreted as delighted laughter and promptly attempted to climb the nearest crystal formation to get a better vantage point. "Right. So you're Blitz," Layla confirmed, watching the small cub scramble up the crystal with the agility of a squirrel on performance-enhancing drugs. This was not how the mission was supposed to go. She was supposed to be documenting defensive capabilities and population counts, not having a conversation with alien toddlers who seemed to think she was the most fascinating thing they'd encountered since their last meal. Holt took another step closer, and Layla realized she was looking at a creature that would probably grow up to be genuinely terrifying by any reasonable standard. His frame already suggested the massive build he'd eventually achieve, and even his juvenile claws could probably cause serious damage if he put his mind to it. But right now, in this moment, he was giving her the same look her sister's golden retriever used when it wanted attention. "This is insane," she said, mostly to herself. "The hegemony thinks you're monsters. They sent me here to spy on a colony of bloodthirsty killers, and instead I find—" She gestured at the three cubs, who were now watching her with rapt attention. "Whatever this is." Nix, apparently deciding that Layla posed no immediate threat, took a tentative step forward. She was slightly larger than Holt, with the kind of alertness that suggested she was the responsible one of the group. Her amber eyes held an intelligence that made Layla slightly uncomfortable. It was one thing to be studied by curious animals, quite another to be evaluated by something that was clearly thinking complex thoughts about her presence. Blitz, meanwhile, had successfully scaled his crystal perch and was now hanging upside down by his hind claws, apparently just because he could. He made a series of chattering sounds that had the unmistakable cadence of someone trying to get everyone else's attention. "Show off," Layla muttered, and was surprised when all three cubs made sounds that could only be interpreted as laughter. That's when it hit her. They understood. Maybe not the specific words, but they were picking up on her tone, her body language, the general meaning of her communications. These weren't just intelligent predators. They were social, curious, and apparently possessed of the kind of emotional intelligence that suggested their species was far more complex than the hegemony's reports indicated, which raised some uncomfortable questions about why the hegemony was so convinced the umbral represented an existential threat. Holt made a low, rumbling sound, not threatening, but clearly some kind of communication. Nix responded with a series of chirps that had the rhythmic quality of conversation. Blitz, not to be outdone, added his own commentary from his upside-down perch. They were talking about her, Layla realized, right in front of her, as if she were a pet or a particularly interesting rock they'd found. The thought should have been insulting, but instead it was oddly charming. Well, this mission just became significantly more complicated, she said, checking her chronometer. She still had over 30 hours left, and she'd barely begun her intelligence gathering. But standing here chatting with alien cubs, even adorable, surprisingly non-violent alien cubs, wasn't exactly advancing her mission objectives. She pulled out her first surveillance device, a small disc that would provide audio and visual monitoring once activated. The cubs watched with obvious interest as she examined it. "I'm supposed to be spying on you," she explained, because apparently she'd decided to provide a running commentary on her own mission to an audience that couldn't possibly understand the implications. "Gathering intelligence about your species' capabilities and social structures." Holt tilted his head again, a gesture that was becoming familiar. Nix made a sound that might have been a question. Blitz, still hanging upside down, appeared to be trying to get a better look at the device in her hands. The smart thing to do would be to plant the device and move on. Complete the mission, gather the intelligence, get extracted on schedule. She had a job to do, and standing around having philosophical conversations with alien juveniles wasn't part of it. Instead, she found herself sitting down on a convenient crystal outcropping and really looking at the three cubs for the first time. They weren't monsters. They weren't the savage predators of hegemony propaganda. They were children, intelligent, curious, social children who happened to belong to a species that could probably bench press a small starship when they reached maturity. "Your parents are going to be really upset when they get home and find me here, aren't they?" she asked. All three cubs suddenly went very still, their ears swiveling toward something Layla couldn't hear. Nix made a sound that was unmistakably a warning, while Holt moved closer to Layla with what looked like protective intent. That's when Layla heard it too, the distant hum of approaching aircraft. Multiple craft, moving fast, coming from the direction of her insertion point. Her chronometer showed she still had 31 hours left on her mission timeline. The extraction wasn't scheduled for more than a day, which meant those weren't her people coming to pick her up early. The cubs had heard something in the engine noise that she'd missed, something that made Nix flatten herself against the ground, and Holt position himself between Layla and the approaching sound. Even Blitz had dropped from his crystal perch and was crouched low, his earlier playfulness replaced by alert tension. "Well," Layla said, checking her weapons and wondering how her simple reconnaissance mission had suddenly become something significantly more complicated. "This should be interesting." The approaching aircraft weren't trying to be subtle. Whatever stealth technology the hegemony possessed had apparently been left at home in favor of the kind of overwhelming force that announced itself with engine noise audible from orbit. Layla counted at least 6 distinct engine signatures, probably more, all converging on the umbral settlement with the kind of tactical precision that suggested this wasn't a rescue mission. This was an assault. "Son of a—" Layla caught herself mid-curse, glancing at the three cubs who were still crouched in defensive postures around her. Even in the middle of what was shaping up to be a spectacularly bad situation, something about their obvious youth made her want to watch her language. She activated her comm unit, hoping against hope that this was some kind of miscommunication, some scheduling error that could be resolved with a few angry words to her commanding officer. Static answered her, the kind of deliberate jamming that meant someone very much didn't want her talking to anyone. "Okay," she said to the cubs, who were watching her with those disturbingly intelligent amber eyes. "New plan. We need to get you somewhere safe, and then I need to figure out why my own people are apparently here to turn your home into a crater." Holt made a sound that was definitely a negative, a sharp, almost dismissive bark that clearly meant absolutely not. He moved closer to Layla, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his dark fur, and settled into what could only be described as a guarding position. "No, no, no," Layla said, recognizing the look in his eyes. She'd seen the same expression on her sister's dog when it decided to protect the family cat from the vacuum cleaner. "You do not get to protect me. I'm supposed to be the dangerous one here." Nyx responded with a sound that might have been laughter, if umbral cubs could laugh at the absurdity of a human trying to assert dominance over creatures that would eventually grow large enough to use shuttlecraft as chew toys. The engine noise was getting closer, and Layla could now make out individual aircraft, sleek, angular hegemony assault ships that looked like someone had crossed a fighter jet with a particularly aggressive wasp. They were circling the settlement in a standard containment pattern, which meant someone back at headquarters had decided this was no longer a reconnaissance mission. "This is insane," Layla muttered, checking her equipment. She had enough firepower to maybe discourage a small patrol, not enough to take on what looked like a full military operation. "Why would they—" The answer hit her like a meteorite to the face. The surveillance devices. Her mission gear. She'd been so focused on the cubs and the discrepancy between intelligence reports and reality that she hadn't considered the most obvious possibility. She wasn't just here to gather information. She was here to provide targeting data. Her gear had been transmitting her location the entire time, feeding coordinates back to a strike force that had been waiting just outside the system. The reconnaissance mission had been a cover story, even to her. She was never supposed to get out alive. She was supposed to be collateral damage in whatever the hegemony had planned for the umbral settlement. "Well," she said, mostly to herself, but loud enough for the cubs to hear, "that's professionally insulting on several levels." The first assault ship screamed overhead, close enough that Layla could see weapons pods slung under its wings. It wasn't conducting a reconnaissance pass, it was hunting for targets. Blitz made a sound that was unmistakably a growl, though it came out more like an angry kitten than a terrifying predator. He was staring at the aircraft with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was memorizing its shape for future reference. "Easy there, little guy," Layla said, but she had to admit she was impressed. Even as juveniles, the cubs had correctly identified the aircraft as a threat and were responding with appropriate hostility. Their instincts were clearly functioning just fine. More ships appeared, spreading out in a search pattern that would systematically cover every meter of the settlement. These weren't exploration craft or diplomatic vessels. These were military assets designed for one purpose: eliminating targets with extreme prejudice. And Layla was standing in the middle of the target zone with 3 alien cubs who thought she was their new best friend. The smart thing to do, the professionally correct thing to do, would be to activate her emergency beacon and hoped the assault force would recognize her as friendly when they arrived. She could explain the situation, maybe even spin her discoveries about Umbral's social behavior into a useful intelligence coup. Except she was starting to suspect that her survival hadn't been a high priority in the mission planning process. The first explosion bloomed on the far side of the settlement, a pillar of flame and debris that sent shock waves through the crystalline structures. The cubs immediately flattened themselves against the ground, but their eyes never left Layla, waiting for her to tell them what to do, as if she had any idea what to do in a situation like this. "Okay," she said, her mind racing through tactical options that ranged from bad to catastrophically worse. "New plan. We find somewhere defensible. We try to contact the adult Umbral, and we figure out how to survive until someone with more firepower than me can sort this mess out." Holt made a sound that might have been agreement, then did something that made Layla question everything she thought she knew about predator behavior. He gently took hold of her sleeve with his teeth and began pulling her toward one of the larger structures, not biting, not threatening, guiding, as if he understood exactly what she'd said and was showing her the way to safety. Nyx bounded ahead, moving with the fluid grace that suggested she knew exactly where they were going. Blitz brought up the rear, his earlier playfulness replaced by alert watchfulness. They moved as a unit, a coordinated pack with Layla somehow integrated into their formation. The structure they led her to was larger than the others, built into the natural rock formation at the settlement's heart. The entrance was an archway that seemed designed for creatures much larger than the cubs, but it was also positioned to be nearly invisible from aerial surveillance. "Smart," Layla admitted, as they slipped inside. The interior was a marvel of organic architecture, all flowing curves and natural lighting that made it feel more like being inside a living tree than a building. "Your people know their defensive architecture." The cubs spread out, each taking what were obviously practiced positions near the entrance and the larger openings that provided lines of sight to the outside. Even as juveniles, they knew how to establish a defensive perimeter. Another explosion rocked the settlement, closer this time. Through one of the openings, Layla could see assault troops rappelling from hovering aircraft. Full combat gear, military-grade weapons, moving with the precision of soldiers who'd done this before. "How many adult Umbral are there?" she asked, though she didn't expect an answer. "How far away are they? Do they have any way of knowing what's happening here?" Holt looked at her for a long moment, then padded over to what looked like a simple crystal formation in the center of the chamber. He placed one paw against its surface, and the crystal began to emit a low, harmonic tone that resonated through the structure. A communication system. Of course, the Umbral would have something more sophisticated than radio waves, something that worked through the crystalline structures that seemed to be integral to their architecture. The crystal's tone shifted, becoming more complex, layered with harmonics that suggested it was carrying detailed information. Holt's expression was focused, intense, as if he was composing a message that needed to convey everything about their current situation. "You're calling for help," Layla realized, telling the adults that the settlement is under attack. But even if the adults received the message, even if they could somehow return in time, what could they do against a full hegemony assault force? Layla had seen the intelligence reports on Umbral physical capabilities. They were individually formidable, but they weren't bulletproof. They couldn't fly. They couldn't deflect energy weapons with their bare hands. They were, ultimately, just a species that had evolved to be very good at hunting and surviving on their home worlds. That didn't make them invincible against military technology designed specifically to kill things. The sound of approaching boots echoed from outside, multiple sets, moving in formation. The assault troops had reached their section of the settlement. Nix made a sound that was definitely a warning, positioning herself between the entrance and Layla. Blitz had found a position higher up, in the chamber's organic architecture, where he could watch multiple approaches simultaneously. And Holt, finished with his message, turned to look at Layla with an expression that made her stomach clench. He wasn't asking for her protection. He wasn't looking to her for guidance or leadership. He was asking for permission to protect her. "Oh, no," Layla said, recognizing the look in his amber eyes. "No, no, no. You're children. Babies. I'm supposed to be keeping you safe, not the other way around." But even as she said it, she could see the calculation in their postures, the way they'd positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of observation and defense. These weren't random positions. They were tactical deployments, coordinated and purposeful. The cubs might be juveniles, but they weren't helpless. And they'd apparently decided that Layla was Pack, which meant protecting her was now their responsibility. The first hegemony soldier appeared at the entrance, weapon raised, scanning for targets. He was wearing full combat armor and carrying enough firepower to level a small building. Professional, competent, and absolutely convinced that he was hunting dangerous monsters that needed to be eliminated before they could spread beyond this moon. He never saw Blitz coming. The small cub dropped from his perch like a furry missile, landing on the soldier's shoulders with enough force to knock him off balance. What followed wasn't the savage mauling Layla had been expecting. It was precise, efficient, and over in seconds. Blitz had somehow managed to disable the soldier's armor systems and weapons simultaneously, leaving him stunned but alive. "Well," Layla said, staring at the unconscious soldier, "that was educational." Nix made a sound that might have been satisfaction, while Holt padded over to examine their captive. The cubs weren't killing the soldiers. They were neutralizing them with the kind of precision that suggested they understood the difference between eliminating a threat and committing murder. More soldiers were approaching. Layla could hear their communications, their coordinated movement patterns. They were good at their job, but they were hunting what they thought were wild animals. They had no idea they were actually facing juvenile military geniuses who happened to have claws. "All right," Layla said, checking her weapons and accepting the inevitable. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Nix, you take the left approach. Blitz, stay mobile and hit targets of opportunity. Holt." She looked at the cub who'd started this whole impossible situation by deciding she was worth protecting. "Try not to get yourself killed keeping me alive, okay? I'd hate to explain to your parents how I got their kid shot by my own people." Holt made a sound that was definitely agreement, then settled into a position that gave him clear sight lines to both entrances. Outside, the assault continued. Inside, 3 juvenile apex predators and one increasingly bewildered human prepared to defend their impromptu family against an enemy that had no idea what they were really up against. The next soldier through the door was in for the surprise of his professional career. The second soldier through the door lasted exactly 4 seconds longer than the first, which was just enough time for him to register that something small, fast, and absolutely furious was using his helmet as a launching pad before Nix introduced him to the concept of unconsciousness via pressure point manipulation. "How are they doing that?" Layla muttered, watching in fascination as Blitz somehow managed to disable a third soldier's weapon systems using nothing but claws and what appeared to be an intuitive understanding of hegemony military technology. They're not just fighting. They're studying the equipment while they fight. Holt, meanwhile, had perfected a technique that involved appearing directly behind soldiers and gently but firmly applying pressure to specific points on their armor until they simply stopped. Not dead, not seriously injured, just very thoroughly neutralized. It was like watching a nature documentary about the galaxy's most polite apex predators. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly surreal. Instead of a desperate last stand, Layla found herself in the middle of what could only be described as an educational demonstration. The Cubs were systematically working through the assault force, treating each encounter as both a threat to eliminate and a learning opportunity to exploit. They're adapting, she realized, speaking to no one in particular. Every engagement, they're getting better, learning the armor weak points, the weapon configurations, the communication protocols. A new sound echoed through the settlement, deeper, more resonant than the mechanical roar of aircraft engines. It was answered by similar calls from multiple directions, a harmonic chorus that made the crystalline structures around them ring like bells. The adults were returning, but instead of relief, what Layla felt was a growing sense of dread. Because she could now hear the hegemony forces regrouping, their communications chatter shifting from confident assault coordination to increasingly frantic damage reports. Multiple targets neutralized, cause unknown. Weapon systems failing across the board. Something's interfering with our equipment. Request immediate reinforcement. The communication cut off abruptly, replaced by a sound that made Layla's blood run cold. The distinctive whine of heavy weapons charging up. The hegemony forces had apparently decided that subtle tactics weren't working. They were switching to the blow everything up and sort out the pieces later approach to problem solving. "Oh, that's not good," Layla said, recognizing the sound signature. Heavy plasma artillery, the kind designed to level entire city blocks. Everyone needs to get out of here right now. But the Cubs didn't seem particularly concerned about the approaching bombardment. Instead, they'd arranged themselves in a protective triangle around Layla, their earlier playfulness completely gone. They were no longer juveniles playing at being dangerous. They were predators who'd identified a threat to their pack and decided to do something about it. The first adult umbral appeared at the chamber entrance like a shadow made solid. 8 feet of midnight fur and barely contained lethality, moving with the fluid grace of something that had never doubted its place at the top of the food chain. Amber eyes swept the chamber, cataloging the unconscious soldiers, the defensive positions, and the humans sitting in the middle of what should have been a massacre. Those eyes settled on Layla, and she found herself looking into an intelligence that was ancient, calculating, and currently deciding whether she represented a threat worth eliminating. "So," she said, because apparently her survival instincts had completely given up, "I'm guessing you're wondering why there's a human in your nursery." The adult umbral tilted its head, a gesture eerily similar to Holt's curious expression, but somehow infinitely more threatening when performed by something that could probably bench press a small starship. Then it did something that made Layla question her understanding of reality. It looked at the Cubs, made a series of complex vocalizations that were clearly questions, and waited for their responses. Holt immediately launched into what could only be described as a detailed briefing, complete with gestures toward Layla, the unconscious soldiers, and the entrance. Nix added her own commentary, while Blitz supplemented the report with what appeared to be a tactical analysis of the enemy equipment. They were debriefing their parent, providing a full situation report that covered not just what had happened, but their assessment of Layla's role in the events. The adult listened with the patience of someone accustomed to receiving complex information from subordinates, then looked back at Layla with an expression that had shifted from potential threat assessment to something approaching curiosity. "Well," Layla said, feeling slightly ridiculous, "apparently your children have adopted me. I was supposed to be gathering intelligence on your colony, but instead I seem to have become part of the family." More adult Umbral appeared at the chamber entrances, not rushing, not panicking, but moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit that had been working together for decades. They took in the scene with the same analytical calm as the first arrival, then began what appeared to be a rapid strategy session. The plasma artillery was still charging, its whine reaching the pitch that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. One of the adults, larger than the others, with scars that suggested extensive combat experience, made a series of vocalizations that were clearly orders. The other adults spread out, moving to positions that would put them between the artillery and the cubs. They were going to shield the young ones with their own bodies, Layla realized. Take the bombardment head-on to protect the next generation, even though it would probably kill them all. "Wait," she said, standing up despite the fact that she was surrounded by creatures that could kill her without breaking stride. "I can stop this. I have hegemony military codes, command protocols. If I can reach their communication system—" The scarred adult looked at her for a long moment, then made a sound that was clearly a negative. Not dismissive, not condescending, just a simple statement that her plan wouldn't work. Because of course it wouldn't. The assault force had been specifically briefed to eliminate all life on the settlement. They weren't going to accept surrender from their own operative, especially not one who'd apparently gone native and started working with the enemy. The plasma whine reached critical pitch. Somewhere outside, weapons designed to crack planetary crusts were preparing to reduce the Umbral settlement to its component atoms. That's when Holt did something that redefined Layla's understanding of courage. He moved to stand directly in front of her, placing himself between the human and the incoming bombardment. Not because he thought he could survive it, but because protecting his pack was more important than his own survival. Nix and Blitz immediately flanked him, creating a wall of juvenile predators who'd decided that keeping one human alive was worth dying for. "No," Layla said, her voice cracking slightly. "No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to die protecting me from my own people." But even as she said it, she could see the adult Umbral arranging themselves in a similar formation. The entire extended family, from the smallest cub to the most battle-scarred veteran, preparing to sacrifice themselves to protect what they'd decided was one of their own. The artillery fired. Layla closed her eyes and waited for oblivion. Instead, she heard something impossible. The sound of plasma fire being deflected. She opened her eyes to see the crystalline formations around the settlement, glowing with internal light, forming a geometric pattern that was redirecting the energy bombardment harmlessly into the moon's atmosphere. The entire settlement was a defensive structure, camouflaged as natural crystal formations, but actually serving as the galaxy's most elegant missile defense system. The Umbral weren't just predators. They were engineers, architects, and military strategists who'd spent generations preparing for exactly this kind of assault. The bombardment continued for exactly 18 seconds before the hegemony forces realized their weapons were useless. The artillery fell silent, replaced by the sound of aircraft retreating at maximum velocity. In the sudden quiet, the scarred adult looked at Layla and made a sound that was unmistakably laughter. "You knew," she said, understanding dawning. "You knew I was here the entire time. You let the cubs find me, let them decide whether I was a threat." The adult made a sound that might have been confirmation, then padded over to where Holt was still maintaining his protective stance. A brief exchange of vocalizations, and the cub relaxed slightly, but didn't move away from Layla. "So what now?" she asked. "The hegemony thinks you're monsters. You've just demonstrated that you're actually a technologically advanced civilization with defensive capabilities that make their military look like children playing with toy soldiers. This is going to complicate galactic politics significantly." The adult looked at her for a long moment, then made a complex series of sounds that conveyed meaning, even without translation. Things were about to become very interesting indeed. Holt chirped once, a sound of pure satisfaction, and settled down next to Layla's feet. Apparently, she'd just become the galaxy's first human pack member. The political ramifications were going to be spectacular. But for now, surrounded by creatures who'd been willing to die to protect her, Layla found she didn't particularly care about politics. She'd found her family among the stars,